A flight attendant jabbed a safety pin into a black teen's neck in a rage, but seconds later, his father turned that very pin into poetic justice. What happens next will leave you speechless. He turned a safety pin into a weapon against a child, believing his uniform made him untouchable. Subscribe if you believe no one is above the law. The safety belt clicked shut around Marlon Tate's waist as the engines roared to life, a low, steady rumble that vibrated through the narrow cabin. He held his infant son, Caden, close to his chest, adjusting the blanket around the boy's tiny frame. The child stirred slightly, his small breaths warm against Marlon's shirt. For Marlon, this flight meant more than just travel. It was a bridge to a new beginning in Granville City, where a stable job and a safer future awaited them. But even as he focused on that hope, unease shadowed him. It wasn't the flight that worried him, nor the turbulence that every passenger silently prepared for. It was the man standing in the aisle, watching him longer than any stranger should. The lead flight attendant, Darius Quell, moved with the authority of someone who believed the aircraft was his kingdom. His uniform was crisp, his posture rigid, but his expression carried something unsettling. Each time his gaze flicked to Marlon and lingered on Caden, his lips curved into a smirk that never reached his eyes. Marlon tried to ignore it. He had endured stares before, stares that judged, stares that measured, stares that dismissed, but this one felt different. It wasn't just cold, it was searching, almost hungry. Marlon shifted in his seat, adjusting Caden again, and tried to distract himself with the routine motions of flight. He glanced out the oval window as the plane rolled down the runway, the city lights shrinking as the aircraft rose into the clouds. The hum of the engines grew steady, the cabin lights dimmed to a warm glow, and a calm seemed to settle across the rows of passengers. Some leaned back and closed their eyes, while others scrolled on phones or spoke in hushed tones. Yet Marlon could not find peace. He felt the weight of eyes pressing down on him, an invisible storm building within the cabin. The young father's thoughts raced. He told himself to stay calm, to focus on the reason for the journey, the promise of a new job, a better life, and the chance to raise his son in a city where opportunities waited instead of obstacles. But each time his resolve strengthened, Darius's shadow passed by, close enough for Marlon to catch the faint scent of cologne, mixed with something sharper, something metallic. Each pass was slower than the last, his glance sharper, as if measuring how far he could push without words. "Can I help you with anything?" Marlon asked softly during one of those moments, his voice calm but edged with guarded politeness. He kept his tone low, not wanting to disturb Caden, who was beginning to drift into shallow sleep. Darius leaned slightly, his angular face lit by the overhead lamp. "Not at all," he said, the words clipped, delivered with a smile that felt less like service and more like mockery. He straightened quickly and moved on, but the smirk lingered, carved into Marlon's memory. Marlon exhaled slowly, steadying himself. He adjusted Caden's position once more, feeling the steady rhythm of his son's chest against his own. The sound calmed him, though his eyes never stopped scanning the aisle. He noticed the other attendants moving with practiced efficiency, offering drinks, adjusting luggage, answering questions. They seemed ordinary, even kind. But Darius was different. His movements were sharp, deliberate, as if each step carried intention beyond duty. The moments stretched, quiet yet heavy. Dramatic irony unfolded quietly in Marlon's mind. This was supposed to be a simple, uneventful journey, yet something darker was taking root in the shadows of routine. He thought of the countless flights he had taken before, none marked by this kind of tension. Why now? Why here? Caden shifted suddenly, letting out a soft cry, and Marlon rocked him gently, whispering words of comfort. He caught the flicker of Darius's eyes again, a glance that did not show sympathy or concern, but something colder, almost like satisfaction. Marlon's stomach tightened. He wanted to believe he was imagining it, that stress was twisting perception into paranoia. Yet his instincts screamed otherwise. Every father develops a sense, Marlon thought, the instinct to know when something threatens the child you love more than yourself, and that instinct told him the danger was not in the air outside, but within the cabin itself. His hand brushed against Caden's blanket, gripping the fabric as if it were armor. He leaned his head back against the seat, trying to appear calm, trying not to invite conflict, but every nerve in his body was alert, waiting. He could hear the faint rustle of newspapers, the clink of glasses, the murmur of passengers settling in, but those ordinary sounds seemed distant. The louder sound was the beat of his own heart, matching the rhythm of his son's breath. Then Darius passed again, his shadow crossing Marlin's lap, and the smirk returned. This time there was no need for words. The stare itself was enough to cut through the calm, enough to plant the seed of certainty. This was no casual glance. This was no accident. Marlin closed his eyes for a moment, gathering his resolve. He could not afford to act recklessly. Not now. Not when Caden needed him steady. But the thought remained, heavy and undeniable. The real turbulence had nothing to do with clouds or storms. It sat in the aisle, wearing a uniform, hiding behind a false smile. When Marlin opened his eyes again, he no longer tried to convince himself otherwise. His unease was not imagination. It was instinct, and instinct had never failed him. Sometimes danger doesn't come from the sky, but from those who pretend to serve within it. Caden's scream tore through the cabin like glass shattering on tile. The sound was sharp, raw, and unrelenting, louder than the steady hum of the engines and more terrifying than turbulence ever could be. Passengers jerked awake, their half-dreams vanishing into gasps and whispers. Mothers clutched their children closer, businessmen craned their necks, and the quiet rows that had been steeped in calm were suddenly alive with panic. At the center of it all sat Marlin Tate, frozen in his seat, staring down at the impossibility before him. A thin stream of blood trickling down his infant son's neck, staining the collar of his tiny white onesie. His heart pounded like a war drum in his chest, each beat shaking loose his disbelief and replacing it with a fury he struggled to contain. Darius Quell was crouched low, his tall frame folded awkwardly, his long fingers still curled around the safety pin as though it were an instrument of ceremony rather than cruelty. His face, pale and angular, showed no remorse, only the faint curl of lips that stretched into something between a smirk and a sneer. It was the kind of smile that belonged not to a man caught in wrongdoing, but to one who knew exactly what he was doing. Marlin's throat constricted, rage and fear colliding until he found himself unable to breathe, unable to even shout. For a moment it was as though the cabin had shrunk around him, every eye turning toward the tableau of father, child, and predator in uniform. The passengers closest to him were the first to react. A man in a dark suit recoiled violently into his seat, his voice breaking as he muttered, He stabbed the baby." His shaking hands clawed at the armrests as though the fabric of the seat could shield him from the horror before him. Another man, younger and wide-eyed, fumbled for his phone, the red recording dot glowing faintly as he raised it with trembling fingers. A third man whispered something under his breath, his voice too low to catch but his expression one of sheer disbelief. The cabin filled with the confused and horrified noises of men who had no idea how to intervene in a moment so grotesque and unexpected. Marlin's instincts finally broke free. His hand shot forward, grabbing at the soft cotton around his son's neck, pressing hard to staunch the flow of blood. Caden's cries twisted into frantic, high-pitched wails, the tiny chest heaving with each gasp of air. Marlin whispered to him, his voice frantic and raw. It's okay, Daddy's here." Yet his words felt hollow in his own ears. No amount of reassurance could mask the sight of his boy's blood seeping between his fingers. His arms shook, not from weakness but from the sheer effort of forcing himself not to lunge at the man crouched inches away. Darius, however, did not retreat. He leaned in closer, so close that Marlin could see the faint sheen of sweat at his temple and smell the sterile, artificial scent of the cologne he wore. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but every word cut sharper than the pin itself. "Careful," he murmured, his tone dripping with mockery. "Accidents like these can get worse if you don't keep them quiet." The sentence was cloaked in plausible deniability, but Marlin felt the venom behind it. His chest burned with the effort of keeping still, his body begging him to fight, to strike, to end this. The silence that followed stretched unbearably. Passengers shifted in their seats, uncertain, their eyes darting from Marlin to Darius as if they were trying to convince themselves that what they had just witnessed wasn't real. One man stammered, Maybe the baby scratched himself." His voice wavered, the desperate voice of someone trying to rationalize the irrational. But another man shook his head violently, pointing with a trembling hand. "No, I saw him. He pushed that pin into the child. I saw it." His words cracked the fragile veil of disbelief, and murmurs spread through the rows, growing louder, sharper. Marlin's breath came ragged now, his vision narrowing as he fought to stay composed. He knew if he lost control here, if he attacked blindly, it would be his word against the uniform. He had no authority, no badge, no power, only the truth, and truth was fragile when weighed against appearances. His objective shifted in that instant: survival and proof. He had to protect Caden, yes, but he also had to make certain this man's cruelty would not vanish into whispers and shadows once they landed. Every second, every choice, had to build toward exposing the reality of what had just happened. Darius seemed to sense this resolve hardening in Marlin's eyes. He straightened, slipping the pin back into his pocket as though it were nothing more than an innocent tool. His smirk widened when he caught sight of the passengers with their phones raised. "Calm yourselves," he barked suddenly, his voice booming down the aisle. "The child scratched himself. That's all. There's no danger here." His words carried the authority of uniform and title, slicing through the murmurs with false confidence. Several passengers hesitated, lowering their phones slightly, while others clung to their recordings with rigid arms, unwilling to erase what they had seen. Marlin swallowed hard, his throat dry, his entire body trembling. He wanted to shout, to call him a liar, to rip away the mask of authority Darius hid behind. But then came the final blow, quiet and cruel. As Darius leaned once more toward him, his voice dropped to a whisper only Marlin could hear. "Keep him quiet, or next time, it won't stop at the neck." The words froze Marlin's blood. They were not the rant of a man out of control, but the measured threat of someone who knew exactly what power he held in that moment. The fury in Marlin's chest hardened into steel resolve. He realized then that this man was not simply cruel or careless, he was deliberate, a predator in disguise, and as Marlin's grip tightened on his crying son, his mind screamed the truth that no one else seemed ready to face. The smile that followed was not one of kindness, it was a warning. The scream shattered the fragile calm of the cabin. Caden's cry tore through the air, sharp and raw, as crimson drops stained the soft white fabric of his onesie. The sound jolted passengers from their drowsy haze, heads snapping up, eyes widening in disbelief. For a brief moment, the world seemed frozen. Then chaos erupted. People gasped, some rising halfway from their seats while others fumbled with phones, their trembling fingers pressing record as if capturing proof could shield them from the horror unfolding before them. Darius Quell did not falter. Instead, he straightened, his face twisted into a mask of false shock. "He scratched himself," he barked, voice sharp enough to cut through the rising cries. His hands moved with exaggerated motions, pointing toward the infant as though staging a performance. His tone was theatrical, dripping with forced concern, as if he believed his authority alone could rewrite what everyone had seen. The overhead lights gleamed off the silver pin in his hand, still glistening faintly with blood, though he tried to angle it away from sight. Marlin Tate's heart thundered in his chest as he pressed a cloth to his son's neck, his arm trembling but steady enough to staunch the bleeding. The warmth of Caden's blood seeped through the fabric, a chilling reminder of how close danger had already come. His jaw clenched as he whispered softly, "You're okay, Caden. You're okay." His voice breaking even as he tried to sound calm. His mind raced, torn between the primal instinct to leap at Darius and the cold calculation that acting too soon could make everything worse. Around him, voices rose in confusion and fury. "We saw what you did," one man shouted from the middle rows, his face pale with outrage. Another passenger muttered frantically into his phone, whispering updates to someone on the ground. Yet for every voice of protest, another fell silent under Darius's glare. The lead attendant carried himself like a man in control, his uniform suddenly a weapon, his smirk hidden beneath layers of feigned professionalism. "Put your phones away," Darius snapped, his words slicing across the aisle. His voice carried the weight of command, and though a few passengers lowered their hands instinctively, others held firm, cameras fixed on him with the defiance of witnesses who knew the truth was too fragile to let slip away. His eyes darted to each lens, his lip curling slightly as if daring them to challenge his authority. Marlin felt the pressure of time bearing down on him. He could sense the danger stretching beyond the cut on his child's neck. This was not about one act of cruelty, it was about survival. His objective shifted in that instant: protect Caden, secure undeniable proof, and outlast the storm circling them. He scanned the cabin, noting every ally and every coward, every phone still recording, every passenger frozen in disbelief. Each detail mattered. Darius leaned down suddenly, his shadow stretching over father and son like a curtain. His lips barely moved, his words a venomous whisper meant only for Marlin. "Keep him quiet," he hissed, his breath hot with malice, "or next time it won't stop at the neck." His eyes gleamed with the cold confidence of a predator, the kind who believed uniforms were shields and passengers were sheep. Marlin's blood ran cold. The words pressed against his heart with the weight of a threat that promised escalation. He looked into Darius's eyes and saw no hesitation, no shame, only hunger. He understood then that this was no accident, no lapse in judgment. This man had chosen to strike, chosen to wound, chosen to terrify. And worse, he seemed certain he could walk away untouched. Passengers shifted uneasily, sensing the shift in the air but unable to grasp the depth of the danger. Dramatic irony cut deep into the moment. Marlin knew the truth, felt it in the blood on his hands, yet those around him hovered between doubt and belief. Some wanted to trust authority, others wanted to stand with the father, and that hesitation was exactly the space in which Darius thrived. Marlin steadied himself, his hand tightening around the cloth pressed to Caden's wound. He swallowed his fury, forcing calm into his voice as he whispered again to his son, "I've got you. I won't let him touch you again." It was not just a promise, it was a vow. He glanced at the glowing phone screen still raised around the cabin, sparks of truth captured in fragile glass. Those devices, he realized, were as much weapons as any blade. Darius straightened, his smirk creeping back as he turned to the crowd, dismissing their outrage with the air of a man accustomed to control. "It was an unfortunate accident," he declared loudly, the words rehearsed, calculated, nothing more. "Remain calm." His voice carried the weight of false authority, but it wavered against the undercurrent of murmurs rising in the cabin. Marlin knew the battle was far from over. His fury burned beneath the surface, his instincts screaming for retaliation, but reason held him still. This was not the moment to strike, it was the moment to endure, to gather strength, to let the predator believe himself untouchable until the trap could be set. His mind sharpened with purpose. He would not just survive this, he would expose it. And yet, in the corner of his vision, the gleam of the safety pin remained, catching the light as though mocking him, reminding him of how quickly innocence could be shattered. He lifted his eyes, meeting Darius's gaze again, and in that stare was the silent acknowledgement of a war that had only just begun. The predator believed himself shielded, but Marlin understood something deeper. Storms can be weathered, predators can be unmasked, and truth can be louder than fear. It was not turbulence threatening the flight, it was a storm given human form. Darius's hand lifted the safety pin again, its metallic point catching the dim glow of the overhead lights. Gasps rippled through the nearby rows, but no one dared move. The cabin seemed to shrink in that moment, air thick with dread, every breath heavy with the knowledge that something irreversibly wrong had already been set in motion. Darius's smirk widened, his eyes roaming over the passengers as though daring them to speak. His voice, dripping with mockery, cut through the tense silence. "What? Afraid of a pin?" The casual cruelty in his tone turned the ordinary object into something monstrous. Marlin's heart pounded, each beat echoing like a drum inside his skull. He clutched his son closer, feeling the small chest rise and fall against his own, every whimper reminding him of the tiny life depending on him. Instinct screamed at him to attack, to tear the weapon from Darius's hand and put an end to the menace. Yet logic, sharpened by desperation, held him back. One wrong move, and the danger could multiply. He forced himself to breathe evenly, his eyes never leaving Darius's raised hand. "If I strike now," Marlin thought, "he'll claim madness, and they'll believe him. I need proof. I need witnesses." He let his gaze sweep the rows. 2 seats back, the businessman with the pressed suit sat stiff as stone, phone trembling in his grasp. The device's red light blinked faintly, recording. Marlin's pulse quickened. Evidence existed, but fear locked the man in place. Across the aisle, a college student hunched low, whispering urgently into his phone. His knuckles were white around it, his lips moving so quickly they barely formed words. Perhaps he was contacting family, perhaps the authorities. Marlin could not know, but the boy's fear carried a spark of usefulness. Then there was the younger attendant, Simon, whose face had blanched to the color of parchment. His eyes darted between Darius and Marlin, indecision paralyzing him. Loyalty to his superior shackled him, yet the horror of the act gnawed at his conscience. Darius tilted his head, still holding the safety pin high as though it were a scepter of power. He paced a slow step forward, shoulders squared, his steps deliberate. "None of you will do a thing," he declared, his voice deceptively calm, the smirk stretching into a grin of confidence. "You'll sit, you'll keep quiet, and this will be forgotten." His eyes flicked toward Marlin, piercing and unrelenting. The weight of his stare was not aimed at the baby, it was aimed at the father's resolve. Marlin tightened his grip on the blanket wrapped around Caden, his fingers curling so tightly the fabric nearly tore. He knew the truth. The uniform, the tone of authority, the calculated cruelty, it was all part of Darius's weapon. He didn't need a gun or a blade. Fear was enough. Yet Marlin also knew fear could be broken. He straightened slightly in his seat, his posture quiet but defiant, refusing to bow to the threat. His mind raced with strategy, piecing together fragments of hope. The businessman's recording, the boy's call, Simon's hesitation, each one a piece of a puzzle that could expose Darius if the moment was chosen carefully. "Timing," Marlin told himself, steadying his breath. "I need timing." His thoughts wrestled with rage and restraint, the primal urge to lash out against the man who had dared harm his child colliding with the necessity of patience. He imagined the courtroom, imagined presenting the very object Darius flaunted now as evidence. He imagined Caden safe, the truth undeniable, justice sealing what fury alone could not. That vision anchored him. The cabin itself seemed to groan under the weight of silence. The hum of the engines grew louder, a constant reminder that the world outside the plane continued, indifferent to the chaos within. Passengers shifted uneasily in their seats, some casting quick glances at Marlin, others refusing to look at all. The tension in the air was not just fear, it was complicity, the dangerous silence that allowed cruelty to thrive. Marlin recognized it instantly, for he had lived through silence before, but this time he would not let it win. Darius twirled the safety pin between his fingers, the motion practiced, rehearsed even, as though he had done it before. His smirk returned as his voice dipped low, mocking in tone. "One wrong move, and who knows what happens next?" His words hung like a blade, slicing deeper than the metal point ever could. Marlin's jaw tightened, his fury restrained behind his steady stare. He refused to answer, refused to give Darius the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. The businessman lowered his eyes, guilt shadowing his features as he clutched his phone tighter. Simon's lips parted, but no words came. Even the boy, whispering into his phone, had begun trembling, glancing over his shoulder as though expecting Darius to pounce at any second. It was a tableau of paralysis, orchestrated by one man's cruelty and held together by fear. But Marlin was no longer just a passenger. He was a father with nothing left to lose and everything left to protect. He shifted slightly, subtle enough not to draw attention but with purpose in his eyes. His hand clenched the blanket, steady and resolute. His mind sharpened, each thought a calculation, each breath a preparation. He would not let his son bleed in vain. He would not let this predator's smirk be the last memory burned into the minds of these witnesses. He fixed his gaze squarely on the weapon in Darius's hand, the gleam of its point a cruel reminder of what had already been done. Yet in that gleam, Marlin saw possibility. The very weapon that had spilled his child's blood could also condemn its wielder. It could become proof, testimony, and justice. He imagined the moment of reversal, the predator disarmed, the pin reclaimed, the truth undeniable. That moment would come. Not now, not in haste, but when the timing was perfect. And so he waited, heart pounding but mind calm, every nerve alive with purpose. He would turn this fear into fire, this silence into testimony, and this weapon into truth. He knew it with certainty, the same certainty that anchored his love for his son. The smirk on Darius's face would not last forever. The very object that spilled innocent blood would soon decide who truly held power on that flight. The cabin's atmosphere thickened with dread as Marlin pressed his trembling hand against the wound on his infant son's neck. The small cloth he had used to staunch the bleeding was already stained a deep red, the sight of it carving a permanent scar into his mind. Caden whimpered weakly against his chest, his tiny breaths uneven, and each sound tore through Marlin like a blade. He bent low, whispering soft reassurances into the boy's ear, his voice steady though his heart pounded like a drum inside his ribcage. The hushed hum of the engines did little to soften the suffocating tension that had swallowed the cabin whole. Every passenger felt it, sitting rigid in their seats, their whispers slicing through the silence like the faintest cracks of thunder before a storm. "Somebody call the captain," a man near the middle of the cabin muttered, his voice shaking with more desperation than authority. But no captain appeared. The cockpit door remained sealed, and the absence of command only sharpened the fear that ran through the passengers like a current. Eyes darted nervously between Marlin, clutching his bleeding son, and the figure who strode confidently up the aisle as if he alone controlled the air they breathed. Darius Quell moved with deliberate arrogance, his long frame upright, his jaw tight, his smirk controlled like a weapon. The narrow lights of the cabin reflected against the glint of the silver safety pin in his hand, a twisted trophy that caught the eye of everyone who dared to look. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. Each step was measured, the slow walk of a man who believed the aisle was his kingdom and that every soul inside the plane was his subject. When an older man sitting on the left side of the aisle finally found enough courage to speak, his voice cracked but still carried weight. "You hurt that child," he said, leaning forward in his seat. "You need to stop this madness." The words barely hung in the air before Darius snapped his head toward him. His eyes burned with icy venom, and his lips curled back into something crueler than a smile. "Sit down," he hissed, his tone as sharp as the point of the pin in his hand. Then, with a sudden flare of menace, he added, "Or you'll be next." The older man froze instantly, his body collapsing back into his seat as though struck by an invisible force. His trembling hands clutched the armrests, his gaze dropping to the floor. The entire row around him shrank deeper into silence, cowed by the effortless domination of a single sentence. Marlin saw it all, the way Darius wielded fear like an extension of his body, the way passengers folded beneath his words. It was not the chaos of a man losing control. It was precision. This was no sudden act of madness, but a performance practiced and rehearsed until mastery. Darius knew exactly how much venom to drip, exactly when to raise his voice, and exactly how long to let silence linger before it crushed those around him. He wasn't improvising. He was executing. Marlin's chest tightened with fury, his son's faint cries igniting a fire that spread through his veins. Yet he forced himself to stay still, to appear calm. He knew reckless anger would make him reckless, and recklessness would endanger Caden more than any pin could. His mind shifted gears, turning inward, searching for strategy instead of rage. The weight of his son pressed into his arm, grounding him. His thoughts moved like pieces on a chessboard. If he lashed out now, the risk was too great. The cabin was filled with frightened witnesses, and fear could distort truth as quickly as lies. But if he waited, if he chose his moment carefully, he could turn this man's cruelty into his downfall. He glanced at the glinting pin in Darius's hand and saw more than a weapon. He saw a symbol. The very object that had drawn blood from innocence could also draw judgment against its wielder. It could shift the balance of power if he played his hand right. Around him, passengers whispered nervously. A mother held her child closer, shielding the boy's face from the sight of Caden's wound. A businessman muttered under his breath, his phone half hidden as he tried to record without attracting attention. A teenager in the back leaned into the aisle, his eyes burning with quiet defiance though his hands trembled against the seat in front of him. Marlin scanned all of them, gauging fear, searching for sparks of courage. He knew he couldn't face this man alone. Not truly. To expose him, to bring down the illusion of authority that wrapped around his uniform like armor, Marlin would need witnesses, voices that could not be silenced. Yet as his gaze traveled back to Darius, he realized the man was reveling in his control, feeding on the paralysis of those around him. Darius paused midway down the aisle, the smirk returning, his voice dripping with mockery. "Do you see?" he said, holding the pin aloft for the cabin to witness. "One sound from me, and you all stay silent. That's how order is kept." His words rolled over the passengers like chains, and for a moment, none dared move. Marlin's jaw tightened. He whispered again into his son's ear, though the words were for himself as much as for Caden. "I'll protect you. I'll make sure the world sees him for what he is." His voice cracked, but his resolve hardened. The older man who had spoken earlier buried his face in his hands, whispering, "God help us." Others looked away, unable to meet Marlin's eyes, but Marlin's objective had already shifted, burning clear in his chest. It was no longer only about keeping his son alive. It was about tearing away the mask that Darius wore, about exposing the darkness that prowled the aisles in the uniform of service. Every heartbeat of his child against his chest was a reminder of what was at stake. Every droplet of blood on his sleeve was a contract, binding him to this fight. And so he waited. He steadied his breathing, his mind sharpening with focus. The safety pin gleamed under the pale overhead lights, catching his eye again and again. It was no longer just an instrument of pain. It was the promise of justice, waiting for the moment to strike. The weapon meant to silence would one day roar with truth. Marlon shifted Caden slightly in his arms, careful not to press against the tiny wound on his neck, but determined that the mark remain visible. The faint streak of blood on the baby's pale skin caught the overhead light like a cruel spotlight, proof of what had been done. Around him, the rows of passengers stirred with unease, eyes darting from Marlon to Darius, but voices still trapped in the prison of fear. The steady hum of the engines filled the silence, making every heartbeat sound louder in Marlon's chest. He leaned forward, his voice low but edged with iron, speaking to the one figure who had not raised his hand in cruelty. "Help me prove this," Marlon whispered. His words weren't a plea. They were a challenge, a seed planted in fragile soil. Simon Core froze, tray still in his hand, his eyes widening as if someone had pulled back a curtain on his soul. The young attendant's lips parted slightly, but no sound came. His gaze flickered instinctively toward Darius, who stood a few rows away, his angular posture sharp and watchful. Darius's eyes narrowed, a hawk circling its prey, daring Simon to step out of line. Marlon caught that glance, and he understood. It wasn't just passengers Darius controlled, it was his own crew. Fear was the leash, and Simon wore it tight around his neck. Marlon kept his voice steady, though his heart thundered. "You saw what he did. Everyone did. But your word means more. They'll listen if it comes from you." Simon's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. His knuckles whitened around the edge of the tray, the tremor in his hands betraying the storm inside him. For a moment, he looked like he might collapse under the weight of the choice. His eyes darted again to Darius, then back to Marlon, then to the baby in his arms. The faint whimper Caden let out seemed to echo through the cabin like a bell tolling. "He'll ruin me," Simon whispered finally, so faintly that only Marlon could hear. His breath was shallow, as if speaking even that much had stolen air from his lungs. Marlon leaned closer, keeping his movements calm so as not to alarm Caden. His face was carved with quiet resolve. "Number he already has. You just haven't admitted it yet." For a fleeting second, Simon's eyes softened. There was shame there, buried under fear. He glanced at the baby again, at the cloth pressed against the wound, and the faint stain spreading wider across the fabric. His jaw clenched, and Marlon saw the battle raging inside him, between loyalty and morality, between silence and truth. Around them, passengers shifted uneasily, some stealing glances, others pretending to sleep, desperate not to be noticed. The air itself felt heavier, as though the very cabin was holding its breath. Dramatic irony filled the space, Marlon knew, as did any who had seen the glint of the safety pin, that the truth was already alive in the room, but fear kept it caged. He needed Simon to be the first to break it free. Darius moved down the aisle then, his shoes clicking sharply against the floor, each step deliberate. His smirk was back, but his eyes were predatory, scanning the rows like a wolf sniffing for weakness. He paused when he reached Simon, his voice a low growl laced with mock sweetness. "Everything all right here, Simon?" "You look pale." Simon stiffened, nodding too quickly. "Yes, sir. Just tired." His voice cracked and the lie sat poorly on his tongue. Marlon watched carefully, noting the twitch in Darius's smile, the way his fingers flexed as though itching to grab the pin again. The man was testing his own crew as much as the passengers. Marlon tightened his hold on Caden, whispering softly into his son's ear, a father's promise wrapped in trembling calm. When Darius finally moved on, Simon released a shaky breath, his shoulders sagging. Marlon seized the moment, his words quiet but unyielding. "He won't stop. Not with me, not with my son, not with anyone. You can keep your silence and let him walk free, or you can choose to stand where it matters." Simon said nothing, but his silence was not empty. It was full of weight, hesitation, and the first sparks of courage. Marlon recognized it. He had seen it in men before, soldiers on the brink of choosing whether to stand or flee. And he knew that once courage caught flame, it could burn brighter than fear ever could. The baby whimpered again, and several passengers looked toward Marlin, their eyes softening despite the terror that kept their lips sealed. Sympathy was beginning to stir, small but growing. Marlin angled himself just enough so that Caden's wound remained in plain view. The truth, he knew, was sometimes best shouted without a word spoken. He sat back then, clutching his son gently but firmly, eyes fixed ahead with the patience of a man who had survived storms before. He would not rush, not force, not break. Timing mattered. Strategy mattered. Darius's arrogance would become his downfall, and Simon's hesitation would one day tip into resolve. Marlin closed his eyes for a breath, letting the thrum of the engines steady his thoughts. Rage clawed at him, begging for release, but he held it down. This was not the moment to strike. This was the moment to endure, to wait for the tide to shift. When he opened his eyes again, they burned with clarity. He whispered as if speaking not only to Simon, but to every trembling soul on the plane. Even the weakest voice can become thunder when truth demands it. The first crack in Darius's control came with a voice that sliced through the heavy silence like a blade. A teenager across the aisle, his face pale but his jaw clenched with courage, suddenly shouted, "We saw you stab the baby. Don't lie." The words carried like thunder in the cabin, shattering the fragile quiet that Darius had built with his smirks and threats. Heads turned sharply. Passengers who had been too afraid to meet each other's eyes now looked up, drawn to the raw accusation. The air itself seemed to change, charged and restless, as if the very walls of the plane were listening. The teen's voice, though shaky, was relentless, echoing off the narrow ceiling panels. His hands trembled, but he kept his phone raised, its red recording light like a glowing witness that could not be silenced. The murmur of the passengers swelled, voices colliding in disbelief, anger, and fear. A few leaned into the aisle, whispering frantically to one another, their words blending into a chorus of doubt against Darius's authority. The lead attendant's carefully built facade cracked, and for the first time since the flight began, the balance of power trembled. Darius's smirk faltered, his lips twitching as if they no longer knew whether to sneer or snarl. But his arrogance returned quickly, his eyes narrowing to venomous slits. He lunged down the aisle, his tall frame cutting through the narrow space with predatory intent. His target was clear, the boy who had dared to speak truth aloud. "Give me that phone," he barked, his voice loud enough to shake even the overhead compartments. His hand shot forward, fingers curled like claws, reaching for the teenager's trembling grip. The boy shrank back, his chair rattling against the window as panic crossed his face. But before Darius could seize the device, a barrier rose between them. Marlin was already on his feet, his body moving with a father's instinct faster than thought. He shifted Caden securely against his chest with one arm while planting himself firmly in the aisle, his broad shoulders blocking Darius's path. The sudden movement drew gasps from passengers, and the cabin seemed to hold its breath as predator and protector locked eyes. The hum of the engines, once background noise, now roared in Marlin's ears like a drum of fate. Darius froze only for a moment, his hand hovering in midair, the silver safety pin glinting faintly in the overhead light. His smirk twisted into something uglier, a sneer that revealed both rage and doubt. He raised the pin again, angling it just enough for the crowd to see, as though to remind them all of the weapon that had already drawn innocent blood. But Marlin's gaze did not waver. His face was steady, calm in its fury, his breathing controlled though his heart thundered. His eyes locked on Darius with a determination that spoke louder than any shout. Leaning forward just enough so that only Darius could hear, Marlin's voice came low and even, yet sharp as steel. "Touch him again, and I'll make sure you regret ever picking up that pin." The words struck with the weight of unshakable truth, not loud, but so clear that Darius could not mistake them. For the first time, the flight attendant's composure fractured. His fingers twitched, his grip on the pin unsteady. A flicker of doubt passed through his eyes, brief but undeniable, as though he had just glimpsed the fact that his prey was not prey at all. All around them, passengers shifted. Phones tilted higher, capturing every second. The whispers grew into low murmurs, swelling like a tide. A businessman near the back muttered, "He's standing up to him," while another voice whispered, "He's not afraid." The crowd, which had been cowed into silence, now leaned ever so slightly toward Marlin, their fear giving way to something else, hope, fragile but growing. Even Simon, the younger attendant, stood rigid near the galley, his face pale but his eyes fixed on the confrontation, caught between fear and the stirring of conscience. The moment hung suspended, stretched taut by anticipation. Darius, once untouchable in his authority, now looked cornered, caught in the gaze of a man who had nothing left to lose but everything to protect. The safety pin wavered in his hand, and with it, the illusion of dominance he had wielded over the cabin. The father and the predator stood locked in a silent battle, their bodies still but their wills colliding with unseen force. For Darius, the silence was suffocating, filled with the judgment of dozens of eyes. For Marlin, it was a shield, a gathering storm of witnesses and truth. The balance of power was no longer his enemies alone, and as the tension mounted, one truth became undeniable. Etched into the expressions of every man watching, the predator had met prey that would not run. And the crowd, slowly, cautiously, began to lean toward Marlin. Fear was cracking, and once it cracked, it could never be rebuilt. He jabbed a black infant and thought fear would silence the outrage. If you believe every act of cruelty must be answered, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. Darius's voice cut through the tense silence like a blade. He's unstable, he shouted, pointing at Marlin with a trembling hand that feigned outrage but carried no real fear. He's endangering everyone here. His tone was commanding, each word projected with the force of someone who had long relied on the power of a uniform to silence doubt. His eyes darted across the cabin, searching for allies among the passengers, but found only hesitation. His smirk returned briefly as he added, "The baby hurt himself. This man is just looking for chaos." For a fleeting moment, the passengers wavered. Their eyes shifted between the man in uniform and the father clutching a bleeding infant. Authority carried weight, and Darius knew it. Marlin felt the doubt ripple through the cabin, saw the way some passengers pulled their phones lower, as though uncertain if they should continue recording. His chest tightened, the sound of Caden's whimpers twisting into his very bones. Words alone would not save them. Marlin's breath steadied as his eyes locked on the safety pin in Darius's hand, the very object that had drawn blood from his child. He knew what had to be done. His arm moved with sharp precision, faster than even Darius expected. In one swift motion, Marlin's hand closed around the bloodied metal, wrenching it free. Gasps erupted across the cabin, a collective intake of breath that felt like thunder trapped within the fuselage. He raised the pin high above his head, his voice breaking through the roar of engines and fearful murmurs. "This," he shouted, his tone raw and unshaken, "is what he used on my son." The glint of the stained metal caught the overhead light, throwing a reflection that seemed to sear into every witness's eyes. The sight was undeniable. Dark streaks of blood traced along its point, evidence that could no longer be denied or explained away. Darius lunged, his face twisting with fury, his body jerking forward like a predator unwilling to lose control. But before his hand could close around Marlin's wrist, a new voice cut through the air. "I saw it." Simon's voice cracked with fear but rang with truth. The young attendant, pale and trembling, stepped into the open, his hands shaking at his sides. "He did it," Simon repeated, louder this time, forcing himself to look directly at Darius. The cabin erupted. Passengers who had been silent now shouted, their voices overlapping in a chaotic chorus. "Call the captain," one demanded. "Restrain him," cried another. The roar of anger and disbelief filled every corner of the aircraft. Phones tilted higher again, capturing the confrontation with renewed determination. Marlin felt the surge of momentum shift in his favor. His heart hammered as he looked around at the faces of strangers who had, moments ago, doubted him. Now, their eyes carried outrage and solidarity. He clutched Caden tighter, the baby's cries still sharp but now blending with the rising storm of voices. Darius's mask of control slipped. His smirk dissolved into a snarl as he barked over the chaos. "He's lying! They're all lying!" But the words fell flat, drowned out by the tide of noise and the image of the bloodied pin glinting in Marlin's hand. The uniform no longer shielded him. The truth had stripped it bare. Marlin stood firm, his body a wall between his son and the predator who had dared to harm him. He knew this moment mattered more than anything. This was proof, witness, and justice all bound together. His voice rose again, clear and fierce. "This is the truth you cannot bury." Darius's desperate lunge, Simon's trembling confession, The passengers' furious cries, every sound fused into a single truth that reverberated through the cabin. What had been meant to silence was now the loudest voice of all. The weapon, once meant for silence, had spoken louder than any voice. Darius lunged without warning, a blur of fury breaking through the fragile order of the cabin. His hand shot forward, the gleaming safety pin flashing under the overhead lights, and Marlin barely had time to react. With Caden clutched tight against his chest, he turned his body just enough to shield the child. The sharp point raked across his forearm, leaving a hot trail of pain and a sudden burst of blood. The sting was immediate, but Marlin refused to cry out. His son's frightened whimper was louder than his own agony, and that sound fueled him more than any surge of adrenaline could. Passengers shrieked, some leaping halfway out of their seats before freezing, too afraid to intervene. The aisle became a narrow battlefield where no one dared step too close. Darius's face was twisted, his smirk gone, replaced by the desperate rage of a man who sensed his grip on power slipping away. His teeth clenched, his breath came in ragged bursts, and his eyes burned with a mixture of hatred and fear. "Give me the child," he snarled, his voice cracked and wild as if he believed sheer force could still bend reality to his will. But Marlin stood firm. With one arm wrapped protectively around his trembling infant and the other gripping the bloodied pin, he shoved Darius backward with all the strength desperation could provide. The predator stumbled, crashing into the armrest of a seat, his balance faltering for the first time since the torment began. Gasps erupted from the crowd, not just at the sight of Marlin's defiance, but at the cruel irony that unfolded before their eyes. The very object that had pierced an innocent child's flesh now trembled inches from the throat of the man who wielded it. Marlin pressed forward, pinning Darius into the narrow seat. His chest heaved with controlled fury, sweat mixing with the blood that streaked down his arm. The metal point quivered at Darius's skin, so close that a bead of crimson threatened to rise if Marlin pushed even a fraction harder. The cabin transformed into a living storm. Half the voices shouted for restraint, half urged him to end it, and all of them vibrated with raw fear. The hum of the engines seemed to fade beneath the pounding of human hearts, every passenger caught between dread and awe. Darius's bravado fractured under the weight of his own weapon. He clawed at Marlin's wrist, his nails digging into skin, but the father's grip was unbreakable. Marlin's eyes locked on him, unblinking, filled with the cold fire of a man who had endured enough. "Look at him," Marlin's voice thundered, his words cutting through the chaos. He tilted his son just enough for the crowd to see the tiny wound on Caden's neck, the crimson stain spreading across the soft fabric. "This is what he did. This is what he calls protection." The declaration shook the cabin. Phones tilted higher, recording every second of the confrontation. Some passengers cried openly, others cursed under their breath, but none could deny the truth that unfolded before them. Dramatic irony hung heavy in the air. Darius, who once ruled with intimidation and a smirk, now sat trembling beneath the father he had tried to break. His lips parted, as if to form another denial. But the words died when Marlin pushed the pin just enough to let the faintest prick draw a dot of red. "Don't," Marlin growled, his voice low, vibrating with fury, restrained only by his son's fragile breath against his chest. "Not another word." His mind raced between justice and survival. He knew that one wrong move could brand him the aggressor, that one rash decision could strip him of the truth he had fought so hard to protect. Yet he also knew that waiting too long might allow the predator to strike again. It was a battle not just of strength but of willpower, fought on the thin edge of control. Passengers shifted in their seats, every eye locked on the struggle. The teenager who had spoken up earlier whispered, "Don't let him up," his voice breaking with both fear and admiration. The younger attendant, Simon, hovered nearby, his hands shaking as he reached out slightly, then stopped, as though unsure if he should intervene or bear witness. Every man in that cabin was caught in the gravity of the moment, drawn to the sight of a father turning the predator's cruelty into his undoing. Darius's voice cracked when he finally spoke, his words stripped of confidence. You don't understand." His throat bobbed against the pin's edge, the small movement betraying the terror he tried to conceal. But Marlin didn't flinch. He leaned closer, his voice sharp enough to pierce through the air like the weapon in his hand. "No," he said, his tone a steady blade. "You don't understand. You don't get to hurt him. Not now. Not ever again." The truth of those words silenced the cabin. Even the engines seemed to quiet as if the entire plane leaned in to listen. The father's resolve filled the space, leaving no room for lies, no space for denial. The predator who had thrived on fear now trembled beneath the weight of justice, his smirk gone, his power shattered. Marlin's arm trembled not from weakness but from the sheer force of holding back the storm within him. His son whimpered softly, the tiny sound reminding him of his purpose, steadying his hand as much as any oath could. He would not let rage consume him, not when the truth itself was already the strongest weapon he had. The crowd erupted again, their voices clashing in the charged air, pleas, cheers, sobs, and warnings colliding all at once. Yet, at the center of it, Marlin and Darius remained locked in their deadly tableau, one man fighting for dignity and survival, the other scrambling to cling to a power that no longer existed. The safety pin gleamed under the cabin lights, its sharp point reflecting the irony of fate itself. And as the moment reached its breaking point, the story of the flight bent sharply toward reckoning. Darius was no longer untouchable, no longer the master of the Isle. He was just a man cornered by his own cruelty, facing the consequence of the terror he had sown. It wasn't just a struggle anymore, it was a reckoning. The father had turned the predator's weapon into the verdict of his own crime. Marlin forced Darius back into the seat, his weight pressing down with the strength of desperation. One arm clutched Caden tight against his chest, the other held the bloodied safety pin steady, its sharpened point quivering just inches from Darius's throat. The cabin became a storm of voices, some screaming in panic, others urging him on, and a few pleading for restraint. The overhead lights flickered faintly as the plane hit a patch of turbulence, casting fleeting shadows across faces twisted with fear. In that moment, the air was thick with dread, and every eye in the cabin was locked on the tableau at the center. A father turned protector, and a predator finally caught. Darius struggled beneath him, his once perfect posture broken into frantic squirming. His hands clawed at the air as though he could grasp back the control that had so easily slipped from his grasp. His voice cracked with false authority as he spat. "He's dangerous. He's endangering all of you." The words, loud but hollow, rang across the aisle, but the passengers no longer believed them. Their eyes darted not to Marlin but to the trembling pin, still glistening with the stain of what had been done to the child. Darius's uniform, once a symbol of authority, now looked like a costume stripped of its power. "Hold him down," a man from the back shouted, his voice carrying both fear and outrage. Another pleaded, "Think of the baby. Don't make it worse." Confusion and conflict spread like wildfire among the passengers, some torn between the instinct for justice and the terror of further chaos. The tension seemed to ripple through the walls of the aircraft itself, the hum of the engines drowned by human voices clashing in waves of panic and determination. Then Simon Core stepped forward. His hands shook, his face pale, but his voice broke through the din like a bell-cutting fog. "He tried to kill the baby," Simon declared, his words trembling yet resolute. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing, but he didn't retreat. "I saw it. He did it." His admission struck the cabin with the force of undeniable truth. Gasps erupted, followed by murmurs that grew into cries of agreement. The once fragmented crowd found its anchor, and the weight of Simon's words sealed what so many already knew but had feared to say aloud. Darius's eyes widened, his frantic protest dissolving into sputtered denials. "He's lying! They're all lying!" he shouted, his voice breaking as he twisted helplessly under Marlin's grip. But the balance had shifted. The predator who had once smirked with confidence now shrank beneath the piercing judgment of dozens of eyes, each one silently condemning him. His hands trembled, not with power, but with the raw panic of a man cornered by his own sins. Marlin's chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, his arms straining to keep Caden close. He could feel his son's tiny heartbeat fluttering against his own, a rhythm of innocence caught in the crossfire of cruelty. Fury burned within him, but so too did clarity. He knew the danger of his position. To strike rashly would risk being seen as no better than the man pinned beneath him. Yet to hesitate too long was to invite another desperate lunge, another moment where Darius could strike. Every second balanced on a knife's edge, the safety pin glimmering as both weapon and evidence. The crowd's conflicting cries deepened the torment. "Do it," one passenger shouted, voice raw with vengeance. "End this now." Another begged, "Please don't. There's a better way." The divide in their voices mirrored the storm raging inside Marlin himself. His arm shook, not from weakness, but from the terrible weight of choice. He saw in Darius's eyes the reflection of all that was at stake: the safety of his son, the judgment of the crowd, the line between justice and vengeance. And then came the irony that made the air colder still. Darius, who had thrived on cruelty, who had whispered threats with a smirk, now whimpered beneath the point of his own weapon. His lips trembled, his voice reduced to pleading. "Please," he gasped, "don't do this. I didn't mean—" His words died beneath the roar of the cabin, but his fear was clear. The predator had become prey, his smirk replaced by the pale mask of desperation. Marlin leaned closer, his voice steady though his pulse thundered in his ears. The fire in his eyes was not of rage alone, but of a father's unbreakable will. He spoke with a calm that cut sharper than the safety pin itself. "Justice doesn't need your lies. It needs your silence." The captain's voice burst through the intercom like a sudden crack of thunder, startling the tense silence that had gripped the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain calm. We are diverting to the nearest airport for an emergency landing." His words were meant to soothe, but instead they unsettled the passengers further. The tone was clipped, rehearsed, and distant. What froze them most was not what he said, but what he didn't do. The cockpit door stayed sealed, as if the crew behind it had locked themselves away from the chaos outside. Marlin's arm trembled from the weight of both his child and the weapon he now held, the blood-stained safety pin inches from Darius's throat. Caden whimpered against his chest, his small breaths quick and uneven, while Marlin forced himself to remain still, his voice silent but his presence unyielding. Around them, passengers muttered with unease. One man whispered, "Why won't the captain come out?" Another replied, "They're afraid of him. He must have connections." The words rippled through the cabin, feeding a storm of paranoia. Darius sat pinned against the seat, his chest rising and falling in sharp bursts. His once smug face glistened with sweat under the overhead lights. For a long moment, the only sounds were the faint cries of the baby and the hum of the engines. Then, without warning, Darius began to laugh. It was not the laugh of relief or surrender, but something jagged and broken, a sound that cut through the air like shattered glass. Heads snapped toward him, eyes wide with dread. His voice lowered to a poisonous whisper meant only for Marlin, but it carried, spreading like smoke across the row. "You think this ends here?" he sneered, his lips curling into a smile that chilled rather than warmed. "I've done worse, and they always cover it up." Gasps erupted around the cabin. A woman clutched her husband's arm, her knuckles pale. A teenager holding up his phone lowered it briefly, his mouth hanging open as if trying to process the weight of those words. The older man who had once confronted Darius muttered, "Dear God," while another passenger fumbled to switch his phone to record, desperate not to miss a second of the confession. The air, once filled with fear, now thickened with disbelief and horror. Marlin's jaw clenched. He could feel his pulse hammering in his ears, each beat urging him to act, to protect his son and the truth alike. The irony struck him hard. The predator, who moments ago had commanded silence and authority, now unmasked himself willingly, exposing the rot behind his uniform. Darius's laugh lingered in the air like smoke from a fire that had long been hidden. The passengers shifted in their seats, murmuring in disbelief, their phones glowing like tiny torches capturing the moment for eternity. Inside Marlin, fury battled restraint. He wanted nothing more than to end the threat with a single, decisive strike. But another voice inside him, the strategist, the father, the protector, warned against it. This wasn't just about vengeance. This was about proof, evidence, justice. Every recording phone, every witness, every trembling voice that now knew the truth could turn the tide not just for his son, but for anyone else who might have suffered at this man's hands. Darius leaned closer despite the weapon at his throat, his eyes glinting with cruel pride. "They'll twist it," he murmured, his breath hot and sour. "They always do. I walk away, every time." His words weren't simply taunts. They were confessions of a man emboldened by past cover-ups, by a system that had shielded him in the shadows. Marlin did not flinch. His voice was low, steady, cutting through the noise with calm finality. "Not this time." He pressed the safety pin fractionally closer, enough for Darius to stiffen, enough for the passengers to inhale sharply. Around them, the phones continued to roll, capturing the image of a predator undone by his own arrogance. Every second felt stretched, like glass pulled thin, ready to shatter. Marlin could hear Caden's shallow breaths against his chest, a reminder of why he endured. The passengers' eyes no longer looked to Darius for authority, they looked to Marlin. Some with fear, some with hope, but all with silent acknowledgement that the balance of power had shifted. The silence deepened until only the hum of the engines remained. Darius's smirk faltered, just slightly, as the realization set in that his confession could not be buried under uniforms or titles this time. His eyes darted toward the cockpit door as if expecting rescue, but it stayed shut. The pilots had abandoned him, and the passengers had turned. Marlin leaned in so close that only Darius could hear his final words, though the passengers read them in his eyes, saw them in the hard line of his jaw. His whisper was calm, a blade of truth pressed deeper than any weapon. Then today is the last time. When the plane landed, the cabin erupted into chaos. The wheels screeched against the tarmac, jolting passengers forward in their seats, but no one seemed to care about the landing itself. All eyes were on Marlin and Darius, locked in a desperate struggle that had carried them through the final minutes of descent. Police officers rushed through the open doors, their heavy boots pounding against the narrow aisle, shouts of "Stand back!" and "Clear the way!" slicing through the din. Yet Marlin acted before they could reach him. With a sudden, controlled movement, he twisted Darius's wrist sharply, forcing the man's hand backward and seizing the safety pin with brutal precision. The struggle lasted no more than a second, but it felt stretched into eternity for every watching eye. Gasps rippled across the rows as Marlin pressed the sharp tip of the pin across Darius's neck, dragging it just enough to draw a thin, bright line of blood. It wasn't fatal, but it was unforgettable. The predator was marked by his own weapon, and silence fell in a wave of stunned disbelief. Passengers leaned into the aisle, eyes wide, some whispering, some filming with trembling hands. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, fear, and the faint metallic tang of blood. Darius froze, his face pale but his lips curling into that same unsettling smirk. Even with crimson streaking his throat, he gave the look of a man who still believed in untouchable authority. Marlin, chest heaving, held Caden tightly in one arm, the baby's cries muffled against his shirt. He didn't shout, didn't gloat. His silence spoke louder than anything, his eyes locked on the man who had turned their flight into a nightmare. The police surged forward at last, 3 officers forcing their way past terrified passengers. "Drop it!" one barked, his hand hovering over his holster, unsure whether the father before him was victim or aggressor. Marlin slowly lowered the safety pin, its tip gleaming with both his son's blood and now his attacker's. He let it fall into an officer's gloved hand, the motion deliberate, controlled. His message was clear. He didn't need vengeance. He needed justice. Authorities yanked Darius to his feet, wrenching his arms behind him. Yet the lead attendant did not cry out, nor did he fight with the desperation of a man cornered. Instead, he chuckled under his breath, a sound more chilling than the screams that had filled the cabin minutes before. His smirk widened, blood running down his collar like a twisted badge. "You think this matters?" he muttered, low enough that only Marlin and the nearest officer could hear. "They'll cover it up. They always do." Marlin's jaw tightened, his thoughts burning with fury and resolve. The words confirmed what he had already suspected. This cruelty was no isolated act. He glanced around at the rows of passengers, at Simon, the young attendant who stood pale and trembling, at the teenager who still clutched his phone defiantly. Witnesses? Evidence? Proof? Whatever protection Darius believed in, whatever silence had shielded him before, this time would be different. Paramedics pushed through next, kneeling beside Marlin with urgent voices. "We need to check the baby now." Marlin hesitated for a heartbeat, his protective instinct screaming not to let anyone take Caden from his arms. But the sight of the boy's bloodied neck and the pale strain in his tiny face forced him to yield. He carefully passed his son into the paramedic's hands, whispering, "Take care of him. Please." His voice cracked with exhaustion, but his eyes remained steady, fixed on the figure being dragged toward the cabin door. Passengers erupted into conflicting shouts. "He attacked the baby!" one man cried, pointing furiously at Darius. "We all saw it," another woman echoed, though her hands trembled so violently she nearly dropped her phone. The officers tried to calm the uproar, their commands swallowed by the tide of voices. Yet amidst the chaos, the truth had already taken root. No amount of denial could erase what dozens had witnessed and recorded. As Darius was forced down the aisle, his smirk did not fade. He twisted his head just enough to lock eyes with Marlin, his voice carrying a final taunt. "This isn't over," The words dripped with arrogance as though he still believed invisible strings would pull him free from consequences. But Marlin did not flinch. He stood tall despite the blood soaking his sleeve, his hand hovering protectively near where his son was being treated. For the first time since the ordeal began, Marlin allowed himself to take a long breath. His chest rose and fell, heavy with the weight of what had happened, but his mind was sharper than ever. This was not the end. This was only the beginning of a battle that had to be fought beyond the confines of the cabin. He could not let the truth die at the hands of polished lawyers or corporate shields. The safety pin, once a symbol of cruelty, had been transformed into a symbol of undeniable evidence. He had witnesses, recordings, and Simon's voice ready to break the silence. The cabin began to clear, officers shouting contradictory orders as passengers fumbled for their belongings, some still shaken, others eager to escape the memory of what they had just lived through. Marlin ignored them all. His focus was on Caden, who whimpered faintly as the paramedics wrapped his wound. Every sound from his son was a reminder of why he had fought, why he would keep fighting until the world knew the truth. As he stood in the middle of the aisle, surrounded by flashing lights, hurried voices, and the lingering terror of the flight, Marlin knew his objective had shifted yet again. It was no longer only about survival. It was no longer only about protecting his son. It was about making sure no other family endured what his had suffered. He glanced once more at Darius being dragged into custody and spoke softly. His words meant for himself, his son, and anyone listening closely enough. Sometimes the smallest cut carries the loudest truth. The gavel struck once, the sound echoing through the hushed courtroom, but it was not enough to silence the tension that hung in the air. All eyes shifted to the witness stand where Simon Core sat, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the railing before him. His voice wavered at first, but steadied with each word. "I saw him do it," he said, his gaze fixed firmly on Darius Quell, who sat only a few feet away, dressed sharply but hollow-eyed. "I saw him take that safety pin and drive it into the child's neck." Gasps rippled through the gallery, but Simon did not flinch now. The young attendant's fear was evident, yet his resolve cut through the heavy silence like a blade. He leaned forward slightly, his breath uneven, and added, "It wasn't an accident. He meant it." The defense attorney rose with practiced confidence, a tall man with slicked back hair and a smile that dripped with calculated charm. "Mr. Core," he began, pacing slowly in front of the jury, "isn't it true that you were under tremendous stress that day? That perhaps, in the chaos, you misinterpreted what you thought you saw?" Simon shifted in his seat, his fingers tightening on the wooden edge of the stand, but he did not look away from Darius. "No," he answered, his voice firmer now. "I know what I saw. I can still hear the baby scream." His words hung in the air with a weight that no cross-examination could easily dismantle. Marlin Tate sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, his arms still wrapped in a bandage from the altercation aboard Flight 607. His face betrayed little outward emotion, but inside, every muscle strained with the effort of holding steady. He studied the jurors, watching their eyes flicker with disgust, shock, and sorrow. He wanted them to see not just his pain, but the truth that Darius had worked so hard to bury. When Simon stepped down, the teenager from the flight was called forward, his phone clutched tightly in both hands as though it were his lifeline. The courtroom dimmed as the footage was projected onto the screen. Gasps filled the air as the video played. The sharp glint of metal, the sudden jab, the baby's cry piercing above the drone of the engines, and finally, Darius's cold smirk. The camera shook with the tremor of the boy's fear, but the image was undeniable. On the screen, the bloodied safety pin gleamed under the fluorescent cabin lights, damning in its simplicity. A woman in the gallery pressed a hand to her mouth. One of the jurors shook his head in disbelief. The defense tried to object, but the judge waved him down. And then came the sound that seemed to freeze the entire room. Darius's voice, low but chilling, replayed over the speakers. "I've done worse." Each word struck like a hammer against the fragile defense his lawyers had built. Jurors leaned forward, eyes wide as the recording repeated. Marlin exhaled slowly, his chest tight. He had known those words would come, but even he felt the sting anew as they filled the courtroom. Dramatic irony swelled. Darius had tried to silence his victim with intimidation, and now it was his own voice sealing his downfall. But the storm was not finished. One by one, other men stepped forward, former passengers from different flights, each with a story of cruelty, threats, or neglect at Darius's hands. A father recounted how Darius had once withheld food from his child during turbulence, sneering that children should learn discipline. Another described being humiliated mid-flight when Darius accused him of faking an illness. Each testimony added weight, and with every account, the jury's faces hardened. It was no longer about Marlin alone. It was about a pattern of abuse that had gone unchecked for too long. The defense tried desperately to redirect. "These are isolated complaints, exaggerated memories," the attorney argued, his tone strained now, his polished veneer cracking. But the judge's sharp gaze silenced him, and the jury no longer looked convinced. Their eyes turned back to Darius, who sat stiffly, his jaw clenched, his fingers drumming lightly against the table. That nervous rhythm betrayed what his stone face could not: fear. Marlin was called to the stand. Rising with deliberate calm, he adjusted his bandage and carried himself with quiet dignity. He described the moment Darius drove the pin into his son's neck, the disbelief that froze him, and the rage that followed. His voice caught once when he recalled the sound of Caden's scream, but he steadied himself and went on. "This was not an accident," he told the jury, his voice clear, "and it was not the first time he used fear to control others, but it will be the last time." The words carried across the room, striking deep into the hearts of those listening. The final moments of the trial unfolded like the breaking of a storm. The jury disappeared into deliberation, leaving the room buzzing with nervous energy. Hours passed, though to Marlin it felt like days. When the jurors finally filed back in, the air was so tense it seemed to vibrate. The foreman stood, his hands steady, his expression grim. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty on all counts." The words reverberated through the chamber, final and undeniable. Marlin closed his eyes briefly, holding back a flood of emotion. Darius's shoulders slumped for the first time, his smirk gone, his mask of arrogance shattered. Around the room, murmurs broke into applause before the judge's gavel struck again for order. Yet the truth could not be silenced now, not after everything that had been seen and heard. For Marlin, it was not triumph, but vindication, the proof that his struggle had not been in vain. He looked at his son's picture on the table before him, his chest rising with quiet pride. The judge's gavel fell once more, sealing the verdict. And in that instant, every lie, every cover-up, every cruel act Darius had hidden was stripped away. The courtroom, once a place of shadows and doubt, now burned with the light of truth. The truth had finally broken free from the clouds of silence. Months later, Marlin stood outside the Horizon Safety Training Center, the newly renamed facility that had once borne the airline's tarnished logo. The morning sun poured down across the wide courtyard, reflecting off the polished glass windows of the building. Reporters crowded in front of him, their cameras flashing like bursts of lightning, microphones thrust forward in search of a soundbite. Yet Marlin did not flinch. His son, Caden, rested quietly in his arms, bundled in a pale blue blanket that covered the faint scar along his neck. Every breath the child took reminded Marlin why he was standing there, why he had endured months of courtrooms, questions, and sleepless nights. This moment was not about triumph, it was about truth, carried into the light where no one could bury it again. "Mr. Tate, do you feel like justice has been served?" a journalist shouted, his voice rising above the clamor. The man's tie flapped in the breeze and his hand shook slightly as he clutched his recorder. Marlin turned his head slowly, his face calm but marked with the weariness of a man who had fought too long. He adjusted Caden's blanket, shielding the boy's face from the flashes, and replied with steady conviction. "This was never about winning," he said. His tone was soft, yet it carried over the noise, commanding silence for a heartbeat. The crowd leaned in, hungry for more, but Marlin left the words hanging, his eyes scanning the building behind him. The Horizon Safety Training Center had been forced into existence by the court's ruling. Its halls now carried the responsibility of retraining flight crews, teaching vigilance, empathy, and accountability. Marlin's settlement had helped build its core program, one dedicated to protecting children and families in travel spaces. He saw the new banner unfurled across its front, its words of promise written in bold letters. Yet promises meant nothing without action, and Marlin knew it. His scars burned faintly beneath his sleeve, a reminder that even victories left wounds. Another reporter pressed forward, his microphone nearly touching Marlin's chest. "What do you hope comes from all this? Do you believe people will truly change?" he asked. Marlin's jaw tightened. He had learned not to trust change born out of fear or lawsuits alone. "I hope," Marlin answered slowly, "that no one else has to bleed where trust should live." His voice did not rise, but the quiet strength in it silenced the questioner more effectively than a shout ever could. A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd as the reporters scribbled notes, their faces reflecting both curiosity and unease. They wanted a story of triumph, a victory neatly wrapped, but Marlin would not give them that. He would not let his son's suffering become a headline without meaning. He felt Caden shift slightly in his arms, the boy's small hand brushing against the scar hidden beneath the folds of cloth. That touch sent a surge of determination through Marlin's chest. In the distance, he noticed Simon Core, the young attendant who had broken ranks to tell the truth during the trial. Simon stood among the onlookers, not part of the press but drawn there, perhaps seeking his own closure. Their eyes met briefly, and Simon gave a hesitant nod. It was a silent acknowledgement that the scars each of them carried were not just physical, but also permanent reminders of a day when silence nearly drowned truth. The questions pressed on, sharper now, some even cruel. One man in a gray suit asked, "Do you believe Darius Quell deserved what happened to him?" Marlin's expression did not shift. He refused to speak the man's name aloud, refused to grant him space in this new chapter. Instead, he held his son closer, his silence answering more powerfully than words. Dramatic irony rippled beneath the surface, because while the world saw reform and rebranding, Marlin saw scars that could never be erased, proof that darkness had walked freely in places meant for safety. As the crowd continued their relentless pursuit of a quote, Marlin took a deep breath. He could feel the weight of the cameras, the weight of expectation pressing on him. Yet he knew that today was not about spectacle. It was about a promise to his son. He leaned his head slightly toward the boy, lowering his voice to a whisper that only Caden could hear. The flash of cameras caught the tenderness in his expression, though none of them could capture the quiet oath that left his lips. "Your pain changed the sky forever." Seconds later, the tables turned, and his power was ripped away. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of racism, power abuse, and retaliation in the face of cruelty. Its purpose is to raise awareness about discrimination, provoke critical thought about authority and accountability, and inspire action toward justice and protection of the vulnerable.